Welcome to Healing from Grief and Loss, where top experts guide you on your journey to find strength, comfort, and joy again. I'm Andrea, your host, and on today's show, my guest expert is the wise and the wonderful Kirsten Frey. So happy to have you. Welcome.
Hi, Andrea. Thank you. I'm delighted to be here with you today.
Yes, thank you. I'm so excited to have you here, and I'm looking forward to you sharing your story and some tips and advice for our viewers. Kirsten is a certified life coach. She's also a transformational life coach, and she is a certified grief recovery specialist. And you, my lovely, have been through a lot of grief and heartache in your time. So I would love it if you just shared a bit of your story with my audience and just sort of shed some light on your journey to healing.
Thank you. I'd love to, and thanks for the opportunity. So I appreciate you saying that I have been through much loss, but that's actually part of our human experience here. So all of us are going to experience grief and loss many times throughout our life. And what's so interesting is that despite that, grief still remains a really misunderstood topic of conversation, and one that's very uncomfortable for a lot of people. So a lot of us are walking around with these emotional wounds throughout our lifetime and not always able to get the understanding and support that we need during those times, because all of us have just really never been taught how to cope with and how to recover from these losses that we're all going to experience.
Yes, that's so true. Like it's just, I hear so much that, talking about grief and loss is taboo. You can't talk about it. You've got to just, get the funeral over with and get on with life. And so I think people are afraid to talk about it. And just with some people and their, the way they grew up, like it's just not something you sit around and talk about. And it's just so important to be able to talk about it and know that you can, and but it's to find that safe place too, and to know that if you are going to talk to someone, you want to feel safe and you don't want to be judged. And so it's something that I just wish more people would talk about, for sure.
Yes, and this summit is such a beautiful opportunity for us to be able to open up that discussion and that dialogue on grief, and that it doesn't have to be that big, scary topic that we're afraid to talk about. So I appreciate the opportunity to share. And as you and I discussed, I will share one of my lost stories, which is the story of finding out that I was adopted. So backing up a little bit, I grew up like most of us, where, grief wasn't really spoken of in the house. Nobody ever sat me down at the kitchen table when there were losses in our family, where we had grandparents die, when our family pets died. It was just these situations happened and we sort of moved on with it. And we weren't really given an opportunity to fully express our emotions in that time. It was either we replaced the loss with getting another pet. We fell into a lot of the myths and misinformation that most of us have learned from a very young age about how to deal with grief and loss in our lives. So the myths that we hear starting from very, very young are things like, don't feel sad or don't cry, as if feeling sad or bad, there's something wrong with that. And that's actually just part of our natural human emotion. We're meant to feel all the human emotions on that emotional range. But so much of our society is focused on positive thoughts, positive affirmations, which is wonderful, but we can't fully feel and express that top end of the emotional scale if we're also not willing to look at the other end of that scale, which is also those feelings of sadness, frustration, anger, all those other heavier maybe emotions. Whereas if we don't allow ourselves those, we don't allow ourselves the true joy and happiness and bliss and contentment that can also come with living a really rich life. So the don't feel sad, don't feel bad scenario, we learn very, very young. Also replace the loss, which usually comes with the loss of a pet. And then that carries on into our life with relationships. So even that first heartbreak that we have as teenagers, you hear that, well, there's plenty of fish in the sea, and, he or she wasn't right for you, and there's going to be someone else. And while that might be factually true, it's not emotionally helpful in that moment. So we don't really complete that relationship that broke our heart. And then what happens is we carry some of those unresolved emotions or feelings into subsequent relationships. So the walls around our heart start to build and build and build, and we're the ones building the wall. So what happens is that we're not really able to step wholeheartedly, trusting into new relationships. So sometimes it's almost like we're sabotaging ourselves before we even get there. The third myth that we hear often is grieve alone. So this was one that I heard growing up in our household where, when my maternal grandfather died, my mom would be off to the side, and my parents were very emotionally distant. They didn't like to show emotion in front of us kids. So I felt bad because my mom was hurting. I could see that. It was so unusual to see her crying. So wanting to go and comfort her and being told to just give your mom some space. She just needs to be left alone. So that message was, oh, so when we feel bad and when, we're sad in our hearts, we deal with it by ourselves. And that's one of the messages I carried all the way through my life. The next one is be strong. That was the other one that I grabbed that and wore it like a banner through my whole life. And as a police officer, I spent 18 years in the police department. That worked well for what I was doing in my job. So the whole being strong, as if being strong, you can't show vulnerability or emotion and that makes you weak. That whole concept, I think, is really being changed now in this day and age, especially with the work of Brene Brown and others that let us know that it actually takes tremendous courage to show up with our vulnerability and fully honest in our emotions when we are experiencing both joy and loss. The fifth myth that we have that we go through is time heals. So we've heard this a lot. Time heals all wounds. And what happens is time only passes. It's the action steps that we take within that time frame that actually help us to our emotional completion and healing from that loss that we have. And then the last myth that we typically hear is stay busy. And this is a big one in our Western culture because there's some sort of thriving on being busy all the time. And all that does is it keeps us from actually acknowledging what are the feelings that are coming up for us in that experience that we're having. And if I just stay busy, time will pass and I'll feel better. But we all know people in our lives who still have painful feelings around a loss that maybe they experienced 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, where it's still as painful for them now as it was when that loss actually occurred. So all of those myths that we've learned, unfortunately, we all have them. That's the framework we all grew up with. So when we are supporting others that are going through loss, that framework is there. So we say things that are well-meaning and well-intentioned, but aren't emotionally helpful in that moment. So I found that through my own story. I've had many losses, but the one that I'll share with you is finding out just 4 years ago that I was adopted. So it came out of, it was a really interesting story how that all happened. And I did grow up feeling like, never knowing that we were adopted, just assuming that my family was my family, but always knowing that my parents were emotionally distant and never understanding why. And really trying to, as a little person, like to crawl up on my mom's lap for snuggles never happened in our house, right? It was, we were taken care of. I know intellectually we were loved, but that love and support that you that I desired at that time never really came through for me. And so as a young person, that was really hurtful. And I didn't understand that as loss at the time. But each time I couldn't bridge that gap between, especially my mother and I, it just created more pain. And as I got into my teenage years, I discovered that it's like, okay, I can manage my emotions myself. I don't have the support or love, feeling that connection and support. So I'll just do it for myself. And I became very resilient and very independent at a young age. And that just continued through my life. I was a police officer for 18 years. I was a personal trainer and holistic nutritionist, and then became this life coach. And it was actually after I was in life coaching where when I found out about the adoption, I can remember when the words were said to me that you are adopted. And Andrea, in that moment, something shifted inside me, and I've always referred to it as a soul shifting moment. And I could feel it. It was a physical feeling inside me where something shifted. And what I didn't realize, it was actually my heart breaking in that moment. And I didn't even have the language to describe it as that. It was just, for me, it was soul shifting, but it was actually my heart breaking. And there had been one other significant emotional loss for me 12 years earlier where I had had that same feeling, that heartbreak feeling. And so because of my background and because of this misinformation that we learn as young people, I felt the feeling, but then immediately shifted into my intellect. So as a police officer, asking questions, trying to make sense of this information, because to me, it felt like my whole life had been this lie. And almost a betrayal, like why hadn't we been told about this? So when I shifted into that intellectual mode, we do that as a way to help us cope and try to find meaning and understanding in something that is like so overwhelming in that particular moment. So I went through several weeks of processing this loss. I had an emotional reaction. I came to understand it and accept it, I thought, and moved on with my life. And I made the decision that I didn't really have any interest in finding my biological family. My adoptive family that I grew up with, everyone had already died. So there was no real way to get answers for the questions that I had. So it was this whole sense of really being incomplete with this loss, but realizing, okay, I've picked up the pieces and I've moved on. I've created a life that I love with my family and my friends that I have now, and I'd be fine. But what happened over the next couple of years was that all that had happened was that I had masked my grief. Right. So I became really adept at suppressing the emotional pain that I was feeling. And what happened is I actually started to take on some other symptomatology. So what was happening is I actually started feeling chest pains where my heart was aching, where it was painful sometimes, and it was there all the time. And I, had all the physical things checked out. I have a holistic health background. So I was doing all the things to be healthy, and it wasn't anything to do with the physical. And so, again, I realized at some point it's this unresolved grief that I had that was actually now starting to manifest in a physical way for me that was really impacting my relationships with my husband and my close friends. And I realized I was the one that was going to have to take the actions to heal from that loss.
I can't even wrap my head around it. Like I don't know how you got through it. It's just like your world was rocked, and I just feel for you. I can only imagine, but that's pretty heavy stuff to be dropped on your head. And like, how did you finally sort of start the process of even feeling good again? Like, did you feel like, do you feel now even that your heart is mended because that time has passed? And I don't like that saying either about, time heals all wounds, whatever. So with the time passing, do you just feel like you have that joy again in your life and you're happy again? And how did you get there? If you feel, if you're happy now, how did you work your way out of that?
Well, it's so perfect, that question, because again, time had passed. I had gone through 18 months, 2 years of adapting to this information and accepting it and feeling like I thought, okay, I'm good with this. But I hadn't been complete with it, which goes to show why these myths that we talked about at the beginning, including time heals, is not true. And it wasn't true for me because time passed. But what was happening is the grief was still there. It was showing up in different ways. And that's what happens with grief, because until grief, like every other emotion, is meant to be fully expressed. So when we suppress it and deny it and bury it, what happens is it doesn't go anywhere. But what happens is when there's grief, it's tremendous emotional energy. So if we're not having healthy ways to be able to express it, or don't feel safe being able to do that, then what happens is that energy stays within us, and it builds and it builds and it builds, and the pressure is can be devastating sometimes. So what happens is then all of a sudden there's a breakdown that's unexpected, that we don't always attach to that grief that we had, but it happens with all of us, because just like with all emotions, we're meant to move through them, and they're not meant to be our place of being where we stay. But people, because we get uncomfortable with grief, because it is painful in that moment, and because it's difficult for us sometimes to find the people to help us, support us through that, that we can be accepted, and as you said, not judged or criticized or fixed as we're going through a loss, because there's nothing wrong with us. We're not broken, we're just heartbroken. And so that's part of our normal human experience. But because we haven't been taught how to do that, that pressure builds, and then there's an impact, and that impact can happen in our health, it can happen in our finances, it can happen in our relationships, in our career, and it keeps us from actually stepping fully into our lives and having this really rich life, which is what we're all meant to have here. So when I went through that, I did all those things like time heals. It did not heal. What healed me was taking the action. So I actually found a grief recovery specialist myself. I did my own grief work, and it took time, and it takes tremendous courage. So for everyone that's watching this summit, that's going through or interested in being able to support themselves and others that go through losses in their life, understand that there's nothing that you need to fix, and you don't need to fix their world or fix their pain, because it's not our responsibility to do that. The pain is there to teach us something. All emotions we feel are language of the body. They're there as messengers for us. And so it's not my job to take away your pain, because there might be a message in that pain for you. It's not my responsibility to do that. Just like it was no one's responsibility to take my pain. And the lessons, Andrea, I've learned from this have been transformative and life-changing, and are still continuing to be. So this whole work that I've done shifted the focus of my business. So this is now what I do, trying to help people educate. And that's what it is get the education out there that these 6 myths are actually keeping so many of us from resolving the grief experiences that we have. And so that there are effective tools to help us through these experiences that we're all going to have. And so the tools are great, not just for the losses that we've experienced in the past, like I had, and I've used my grief work to work through many of the losses that I've had, but they will also help me deal with any losses that are coming in my future, and that I am able to be a better support for those people in my life that go through their own losses. And so I love what I do, and I love this opportunity, and the information and experts that you've brought on this summit are it's just beautiful, especially during this time. I think our world is grieving, and we need as much support and compassion and joy as we can all have.
Yes, well said. Yeah, very well said. That's the whole reason behind this for me is because I've gone through so much myself, and I know that there's a light at the end of the tunnel, and it's just, I just want people to know that there is help out there. There is support there. Don't be afraid to look for someone or something, or talk about it, and to deal with it. We talk about everyone's grief is unique, and it is, and everyone's timeline is unique, but it's just so important for me to know that I just want to get out there. You're not alone, and there's just so many resources, and I just want people to, even if you just get out of bed and do, one thing, and then that turns into, maybe the next day you do two things. Like, just, you've got to keep moving forward, and you can't just stay stuck. You've got to be kind to yourself. And I had to learn that, like, just, Andrea, don't be so hard on yourself. And, I had to be a little bit more compassionate with myself. But then it got to the point where I can't do this by myself. So that was my whole intention of doing this summit, is I hope we reach as many people as we can, and we get people can get some help and get some tools, get some tools in their tool belt. And I love what you do, and I you're such an inspiration, and so wise. And I just, the myths are, it's just crazy, the myths, and it's crazy what we grew up, or what we've grown up believing. And we've got to crush those myths, for sure. Yeah, for sure.
Well, and that's the key to all of this, that I believe that we are all meant to live our lives fully expressed and emotionally free. But we've learned to go into the arena of life like brave-faced and fully armored, as if somehow being strong, and I'd say to people now, you can be strong or you can be human.
Yeah.
And we adapt to this heavy load that we carry through grief. But it's when we armor ourselves against the vulnerability of those conflicting emotions that we have that come with grief, that's when we shut ourselves off from the connection, the love, and the support that we need. So removing the mask, unmasking our grief, and taking off the armor so that we can be seen and heard, because that's all that people who are grieving want. They just want to be seen and heard in their moment. Opens that door to trust and empathy and healing and belonging and joy and love. That's the gateway that we must go through. So I'm just completely honored and so grateful, because if I hadn't gone through my own loss experiences, I wouldn't be able to hold this space for people now. And so I appreciate, again, the opportunity to come out here and speak to your audience about this, and to re-certify what you're saying in terms of, you're not alone. There's so many of us, we go through so many loss experiences in our life. To me, it seems unfair that there's so many people walking around wounded when we don't have to be. And that there are people that do understand grief and can hold that space for you as you go through that loss. Your loss experience, as you said, is your own, uniquely your own, even if we experience similar losses. But I can hold that space for you and shine that light and remind you that, yes, you can come through this, that there is joy and healing and light at the end of the tunnel. You're 100% correct.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. Yeah, I just want people to know that, what was I going to say about your grieving in your own way, but just to come forward and to I think some people just feel that they don't want to burden someone, so then they they don't want to talk about it. They don't want to burden, or they have people that don't understand, so they're like, oh, here she goes again. So it's important to find that person that will just sit with you and hold your hand if that's all you need, and just listen. The other person doesn't even have to say anything. Just be present, just be there. But it's just giving people the strength to find that person that you can talk to, with, like we said, without being judged, without being ridiculed or criticized, or here she comes, and just like yourself. and myself. Find us that, we're going to hold that space for you and we're going to help you through this. We're in this together. The only difference is that Kirsten and I, we've come out the other side. We've gone through the trenches and we're on the other side. And there is light at the end of the tunnel. Trust me there, for sure. Yes.
In grief recovery, sorry to interrupt you, Andrea. In grief recovery, we call it being a heart with ears. Yeah. And that's all people want, because again, I think when you talk about, we don't want to burden others, because that's again messaging that we've heard growing up sometimes, or we feel that when we do try to share and we can see that the other person is uncomfortable. So it continues to isolate grievers. And really the only way to move through grief and loss is to participate in that healing yourself. But as you said, with people who can hold that space for you to do that. And oftentimes our grief makes other people uncomfortable because it triggers in them sometimes maybe unresolved grief that they have, or the feeling of, I don't know how to help you. And so I would just rather avoid this whole conversation, which makes the griever feel like nobody wants to listen to me. They don't feel seen and heard. And then that just compounds the grieving and loss that they're already experiencing right now.
Yeah, I totally agree. So that's the message we need to get across through this summit is all the above, what you just said. I love it. Thank you. So,
my pleasure.
Before we sign off, is there anything else that you would like to share with my audience?
Yes, because a lot of what I do is education. So it's about teaching people the effective tools that will help them with grief and loss for themselves and for the ones in their family and friends that they love. So I'm going to include a link for an ebook for everyone that's on the summit that would like to participate in that. And it's about the 6 myths of grief. So it will go into greater detail what you and I talked about today. Just the 6 beliefs that keep us moving forward into our healing from a loss. And so I think that would be really helpful, again, having people heal and understand what grief is. When we can expand that so we can all hold that space for each other, I think we're really taking a huge step towards healing the world and everyone that's in it. It starts individually, but it compounds out. And when we are able to hold that space for other people, then that ripple effect just takes over. And so that's the purpose and the intention behind this gift.
Right. Thank you. I love that. I love that. Thank you so much for being with me today. And you shared so much. Oh my goodness. Yeah, I love what you do. I love what you stand for. I can't wait to meet you in person. And yeah, thank you so much. It's just, I love this.
Thank you, Andrea.
I loved listening to you, and just so great having you on the show today. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So to my audience, thank you for tuning in. I hope something touched your soul. A lot has touched mine, as it always does. When I talk to these experts, they have so much wisdom and advice and just so much to say and share. And until the next time, I'll repeat myself, be safe, be kind to yourself, and most importantly, just remember, you are not alone. So we will see you next time. Bye for now.